guess you're just clicking on random YouTube videos to waste your internet bandwidth. Shame on you. This is Zilog and Moto, where we take closer looks at all things Sega 8 and 16-bit. On today's episode, we're back on the 16-bit side of things with the first entry in the Joe Montana Football series. If you're familiar with the Genesis, or perhaps the Game Gear / Master System back in the day, you've probably heard of the Joe Montana series, as it was realistically the only football series that was able to compete with John Madden Football. And Sega's success with their own sports title led to the eventual NFL 2K series, that sadly is no longer with us, due to the fact that it competed so closely with Electronic Arts in the early 2000s. If you're not familiar with that story, think about it. Every year there's only one licensed NFL title that's released every August, and that's Madden. If another football title happens to be released, it doesn't have the NFL license. It just has random teams, a la the re-release of Technobowl that came out a few years ago. The reason for this is that the NFL 2K series competed with Madden so closely that in December of 2004, Electronic Arts had had enough and went to extraordinary lengths of securing a license to exclusively produce NFL games in perpetuity to avoid competition. This exclusivity all but quelled the ability for anyone to compete in the football realm, but didn't stop a few attempts that were squashed with relative ease. However, what if I told you that theoretically the fact that this situation existed to begin with was somewhat Electronic Arts' fault? How, you ask? Well, you see this game here? It was made by Sega, right? Not exactly. While Joe Montana Football was one of the early Sega landmark licensed sports titles like Tommy Lasorda Baseball, Pat Riley Basketball, Arnold Palmer's Tournament Golf, it was actually not developed in-house by Sega. Sega had their various development teams busy with other titles, arcade conversions, etc. But Sega of America specifically knew that they needed a football title for the console. So, Sega contracted out through a developer called Mediagenic. You're probably familiar with Mediagenic, even if you don't recognize that name, as Mediagenic was the temporary name that Activision used in the late 80s, early 90s, after they had bought and incorporated well-known text adventure company Infocom, before eventually righting the ship and being sold and then going back to the Activision name. So yes, you heard that correctly. Sega had contracted a massively in-debt game company that at the time was most well known for Zork adventure games to create their flagship football game starring Joe Montana. Unsurprisingly, at the last minute, Sega found out that development on Joe Montana Football had turned into a dumpster fire, but still had to produce a football game with the Joe Montana name license, or essentially lose a year's sales to make up the cost of $1.7 million license agreement. So what did Sega do? They called up Electronic Arts to see if they had a game that could be converted into Joe Montana Football in a short amount of time to try to salvage the holiday season. Electronic Arts, close to the completion of the Genesis port of John Madden Football, did agree to work with Sega and create a football game that you can tell resembles Madden in ways, but was also substantially different and admittedly a bit inferior, as they didn't want to give Sega a game that was better than their own. After the first year of Joe Montana Football, Sega was able to use a different developer and drastically change the game, but if it had not been for Electronic Arts stepping in that first year and propping up the franchise, it may never have had the competition from Sega that led to their later war with NFL 2K. So, how is the original Joe Montana Football? Is it some weird Frankenstein of an arcade game with Madden? Does it feel like Madden but just slightly tweaked? Well, let's take a closer look at the cartridge and then get into what its versus and what it isn't. And here is Joe Montana Football, assuming you can read his signature down there at the bottom. Nice classic picture of Joe at the top and what appears to be a custom-made Sega football jersey. I say appears to be as I'm pretty sure this isn't a Photoshop job, as there's a classic commercial for this game where he wears a similar jersey. The commercial actually made to YouTube, and I found it, so I'll place a link for it down in the video description. Joe Montana Football is actually the second oldest Genesis game we've taken a look at so far, but since Lakers vs. Celtics was an Electronic Arts game, this is the first time we're seeing what I refer to as a classic Genesis black box release. By 1989, Sega of America had finally figured out that the old Master System covers that I've complained about ad nauseum sucked, but they still wanted to have a nice universal design. So they took the solid background
with crosshatch that they've been using for the Master System, and instead replaced it with a much sharper looking black and gray version that really made the vastly improved cover art pop on retail shelves. This particular case is in pretty good shape. Hang tab is intact at the top, and there's no tears to the plastic anywhere, and the inner cover itself is in pretty much perfect condition. Over on the back there's a little bit of scratching in the middle of the cover that you can kind of see, but you gotta be looking at it pretty closely to notice it. On the back there's a nice layout showing 3 decent quality screenshots of the game, but the way the bottom one's cropped down here, it's really kind of hard to see what's going on there and what's being shown. So that one they probably could have done a better job with. Also down at the bottom there's some fine print. You can barely read this here. This game is not sponsored, licensed, or endorsed by the National Football League. I'm not sure why they had to put that disclaimer on the game, other than perhaps because up above they mentioned how Joe had won 4 Super Bowls, which is a trademark that NFL voraciously defends, but it's interesting nonetheless. As we open the case, you can see the cartridge is in good shape here. And then the manual, which is in really good shape, other than a slight bend up here at the top corner, and an early Genesis poster, which we'll take a closer look at, assuming I can get it in the camera. Let's see, this is one of these that folds out. We'll try to... Yeah, there's no way I'm going to be able to get all that in the shot, but you can kind of see what we're going for there. And then, of course, the other side of the poster, which is really what Sega was going for, wanting to get people to look at, it's got all these pictures of upcoming games and things that have been released, advertising for other things on the system that you might be interested in. One interesting thing to note here is we see we got screenshots for everything except here, Wrestle War coming soon. No screenshot for it. And apparently it was not coming soon, after all, because it never came out in the United States. I don't really know why it didn't come out here, because it did get released in Europe and Japan. So we'll look at it in a later video. The only thing I can think was that WCW had an event by the same name, which may have caused an issue, or that some of the in-game wrestlers were essentially rip-offs of real wrestlers, which might have been problematic as well. Anyway, back to the game, and specifically the manual. The manual is a little odd to me, because unlike the Master System manuals or later Genesis manuals, the paper in here isn't glossy. And you can even see that there's a slight bit of yellowing going on here on these pages. While there's a few pictures included here or there, ultimately this manual, just look at all this text here. This manual is really dense. It almost looks like an old school textbook. Like, honestly, I remember growing up with like this old math textbook that my grandfather had, and the way this stuff is laid out in the typeface, it really reminds me of that. The information included is solid for the most part, but you're not going to be able to just flip through it real quick and figure out what you need to know just due to the way it's laid out. At the end of the manual, there's a section that lays out all the different plays in the game on both offense and defense, which is nice, but it's a bit unnecessary as all the teams use the same plays, and with only 24 on either side, it doesn't really take much to scroll through and then choose a play. What really should have been included in the manual that isn't here is the description of each of the 16 teams included in the game and their specific strengths and weaknesses. They are not all equal, apparently, but good luck figuring out which team might be best for your playstyle and which ones you should probably avoid. Okay, so that's what our first black box game looks like. Now let's get to the game and see if Sega managed to get a decent release out of all the chaos surrounding this title. To get the elephant in the room out of the way, let's go ahead and compare the game to Madden, or more specifically, the original John Madden Football, its direct competitor, and half-brother. The first thing I immediately noticed before really digging into this is that the fonts and graphics used in the play window are exactly the same as Madden. It's clear those assets were utilized in both games. The actual play calling works a bit different, and it's somewhat awkward at first if you're used to Madden, because you use the D-pad to choose the play versus the A, B, or C buttons, and then vice versa to maneuver between play selections. However, you do eventually get used to it, for the most part, and it's not a bad setup. The options screen at the beginning of the game uses more fonts that are similar to Madden, and the game's setup options are relatively similar as well, with the major exception being the time available for games, which rather than setting 5, 10, or 15-minute quarters, you now have the option of total game times of 10 to 60 minutes in 10-minute intervals. Not a big difference, but does allow for more options than Madden, including the quickest game possible between the two. The last way I see a somewhat direct connection between Madden is in the realm of music and sound effects. As I've mentioned plenty of times in the previous videos, early Electronic Arts games tended to have a very distinct sound from a music perspective. Something about the way the synths were programmed in the game, where certain ones tended to have a shrill drone to them. Sort of like an annoying horn is the best way I can describe it. Now, not all EA games had this issue, and usually the games with Rob Hubbard soundtracks came across a bit better. But in playing Electronic Arts games versus non-Electronic Arts games so far on Zilog and Moto, it's almost a signature of their development kit. John Madden Football doesn't have a ton of music, but if you listen to the music it does have, you can definitely pick up parts that sound straight out of EA's repertoire. The sound effects of the ball being kicked, and the player grunting and hitting one another, also sound very reminiscent of what you would find in the Madden title. I don't think they're the exact same sound effects, but I could see a situation where they were sort of B-roll sound effects that had been created for John Madden Football and just gone unused. Now that that's all out of the way, let's talk about the game in a bit more depth. Or as much as we can, because I've got to be honest, like many other early sports titles, there's not a ton here to discuss. After seeing a nice digitized picture of Joe, you get to the game's main options screen. From this screen, you can choose from fairly traditional options, along with choosing the type of game that you would like to play. You can play a normal single game, either against the second player or the computer, start your attempt at the Sega Bowl, or play a 2-minute drill game, where you're given the ball and are down a random amount of points less than a touchdown, and your job is to drive down the field and score to win the game. Having the 2-minute drill option is a nice bonus, as it adds something different to the game to set it apart a little bit, but I don't know how much use it would actually get from the average player. Single game mode is pretty self-explanatory, so we'll get into Sega Bowl mode instead. Similar to the playoffs option in Madden, Sega Bowl mode allows you to pick one of the 16 teams and go head-to-head with a series of 4 teams, culminating in an appearance in the Sega Bowl against, you guessed it, Joe Montana and the San Francisco squad. As mentioned earlier, the game definitely has internal ratings for the different teams, because as you play each team, Joe will talk first a bit about your team, describing its strengths and weaknesses, and then talk about your opponent. Not coincidentally at all, your first game is usually against an easier team, followed by 2 more difficult teams, and then finally San Francisco, which is pretty ridiculous in comparison. The teams appear to be picked at random, as I've played a few different sets of teams on the way to San Francisco, with the only commonality being starting with the easier teams before faced with the more difficult ones. I like the randomness here, and the staggered difficulty, although San Fran is a bit too good, but it's pretty much the same as what John Madden Football offers. Having said all that, Sega Bowl mode has one absolutely fatal flaw: the complete lack of an ability to save and continue your progress. I suppose if you're going to look at the game through the lens that it's slightly more of an arcade title than simulation, then it makes sense not to have a save game feature, and you have to fight all comers each time through. And that would be fine if it wasn't for the fact that it takes approximately 30 minutes to play one game, if you choose 5-minute quarters. Want to try to win the Sega Bowl in that scenario? Well, if you don't have anything to do for 2 hours. Not being able to have at least a password save to record your progress through the Sega Bowl is inexcusable. And I can only think that perhaps it's one of those features that a developer Park Place decided to take out of the game to try to keep it inferior to Madden in an effort for EA not to compete with itself. For what's effectively a 1990 game, and pretty early into the Genesis lifespan, the game has some nice graphics and sound. It's far from what the Genesis would eventually produce, and I would say John Madden Football is probably better overall in both categories for an apples-to-apples comparison. But the digitized pictures of Joe Montana look great, and I would say they're better than what we saw much later in the cutscenes, let's say Cliffhanger had, just for a comparison to something else we've looked at so far on the channel. There are also some nice animations and digitized speech to go with certain plays in the game that were as good as anything else that was going on at the time in the 16-bit realm, and certainly put anything present on the NES to shame. In that regard, the Sega does what Nintendo don't ad campaign was totally true. In a rating that I wasn't expecting when I started this review, I'm giving Joe Montana Football 3 stars. I was fully thinking this is just going to be a half-assed football game that has no place next to Madden. But I've got to say, I really liked how easy it was to pick up and play, and having good gameplay goes a long way with me. I especially liked how you could pick your primary receiver before the play started, so you didn't have to waste time cycling through and potentially getting sacked. And the game has a nice balance of extra offense without turning into NFL Blitz. Sure, there are plenty of things wrong with it, like not having an NFL license, not being able to save your game, minimal statistics, no player numbers, names, but the game could be far, far worse. I have had fun playing Joe Montana Football for the first time this week, and it was nice playing a decent football game that wasn't Madden related.
And that was Joe Montana Football for the Genesis. Later on, we'll take a look at the next 4 games in the series along the Genesis, along with the Master System and the Sega CD versions. I've played a few of those, but certainly not all of them, so that'll be interesting to check out. Tune in next week when we take a look at the Genesis version of a TV show that captivated millions, with tennis balls and oversized Q-tips. And remember, whatever you play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.